Hi class, my name is Stephanie Volovinos. I'll be presenting Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr., 1963. This is a general analysis of the letter and how the public conveyed it and the background. So let's head off to the first side. So first we're going to go through the background. What was happening at this point in time, and this is basically to show you the general atmosphere of what was going on in Birmingham, why Martin Luther King was in jail in the first place, why he chose to write the letter, and what he was aiming towards when writing it. This leads us to the importance of the letter itself, how it was meant to impact the movement, why Martin Luther King felt the need that he needed to publish this at that time, so much so that he wrote this on any scraps he found in the jail cell, including some back in newspapers and legal pads from his lawyers. And next we're going to go through a general analysis of the letter, some important things that I found very interesting, things like analogies, some biblical analogies in particular I found interesting that he used to express how he felt, during this movement, and the importance of it overall. Finally, we're going to go through some historical art I found very interesting, particularly some street art in Birmingham that generally relates to what was happening at this time. And yeah, so let's get started. So first I'm going to show you guys this video that I found that basically summarizes most of the background. So let me go ahead and play it for you.
On April 12, 1963, approximately 1 week after the onset of mass public protests, King and Ralph Abernathy, fully aware that they were breaking Alabama's law against public demonstrations, put on work clothes and marched from 6th Avenue Baptist Church into a police wagon that was parked in the area. Of course, King was arrested. In response to this event, 8 local clergy members wrote a letter that was published in the Birmingham News, criticizing King's actions as, quote, unwise and untimely, end quote. They counseled patience and adherence to, quote, the principles of law and order and common sense, end quote. King's letter from a Birmingham jail is his response to these criticisms, specifically his argument as to why African Americans could not continue to simply wait for reforms to happen. While incarcerated, King began the letter on scraps of newspaper. He continued it on bits of paper provided by a black trustee, and finally finished it on pads of paper left by his attorneys. The letter explains King's 4 steps to what he called direct action, and explains that the purpose is to provoke a crisis to compel the other side to negotiate. King's letter initially was released in mimeograph form, but later was published in several different formats, including a pamphlet distributed by the American Friends Service Committee and an article that appeared in 4 different magazines. William Fitz Ryan, Democrat from New York, introduced the first half of the letter into congressional testimony, and it was thus published in the Congressional Record. The following year, King included a revised version of his letter as a chapter in his book, Why We Can't Wait, a memoir of the Birmingham protest campaign.
Okay, so now that video is finished, I want to talk about something she mentioned, negotiation. That's going to be a very central theme in this letter that we're going to go over very heavily, because a lot of what this letter was meant to push forward is negotiation. What didn't go through the minds of the several people on the opposing side of this is that the only reason Martin Luther King felt the need to incite these acts was because negotiation was not met, So let me move on to the next slide so we can talk more about that. Sorry. Okay. Reasons MLK was in Birmingham jail. Sometimes a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I have been arrested on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there is nothing wrong in having an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, but such an ordinance becomes unjust when it's used to maintain segregation to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest. So, in this section, inside the letter, Martin Luther King basically lets the audience know why he's in jail, and in this case, it's because he was arrested on parading without a permit. He explains the reasoning for his need to parade without why he felt the need to parade without a permit. It was because he was fighting towards a greater cause, and breaking that one law and taking the consequences is his way of expressing that he felt the law was unjust, and he was okay to follow all the consequences that came with breaking it, because he wanted to show how unjust it was, how he felt it was unjust, and he would take the consequences, not run from them, but take them. Reason why he's in jail, and I find that very honorable, and yeah, I like that. So next we're going to speak about his motivation. So I'm gonna read you guys this quote from the letter. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, march, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issues. It seeks to dramatize the issues that it can no longer be ignored. So what this means is that him writing this letter was meant to push negotiation. He wanted negotiation. People ask, why didn't he go for negotiation in the first place? Well, he did. The reason why all the protests are happening is because negotiation wasn't met. The community, again, I'm going to read you guys this expert from it, a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. And it seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. This line I felt is so powerful. To dramatize the issues, it can no longer be ignored. So this is basically bring as much light as you can to it, because they tried the other route and it didn't work for them and nothing was getting done. But they wanted negotiation in the first place. The only reason they were going for direct action is because it was being ignored. Their calls for negotiation were being ignored. So now let's read this next quote. The purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. So with this, we see that negotiation during this movement was the aim. It was the goal. But they needed other methods in order to get to that goal, because what they were doing wasn't working. And they needed something more direct to confront the issue. So let's move on to the next slide. What did Alabama do? So this first section I labeled no growth. So I'm going to read what I want to interpret from this quote. It's kind of long, so you can pause and read it if you like, but I'm going to just take out the part that I need. I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined legal and nonviolent pressure. So what Dr. King was trying to convey when he said this is that, well, exactly what he said. We have not made a single gain in civil rights without the determined legal and nonviolent pressure. And with this says a lot in itself. With that, no progress has been made. And as much as he wants it to be negotiation, there comes a certain time when, you realize that what you're asking for isn't being met, and what they supposedly quote unquote want from you isn't being, held to the same standards. So this is when you need to find other methods of, getting their attention. So that kind of not foreshadows, but sets the tone. Next, we're going to go to injustice. There have been more unsolved bombings of homes and churches in Birmingham than in any other city in the nation. And this is a lot, because here it is just a sentence, but it holds a lot of emotion. Like, this quote is meant to represent the fear that Black people lived in. in Birmingham, and sometimes still today in rural areas in the South. And it's really tragic, and he wanted to show just how inhumane it is to have people live in fear, and how unjust it is, especially for Alabama to, basically ignore these things and not look for the people responsible. So next we're gonna go why negotiation was no longer an option. And this is the quote: "But it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the community with no alternative." And this is when he's finally saying that they had no other choice for negotiation. If they wanted negotiation, they had to go another route. This is him basically saying that it wasn't their decision. It was Birmingham's. It was the city of Birmingham and the supporters against this movement. So we're going to go ahead and move to the next slide. And this is a quote that I found rather interesting, based around injustice. "But more basically, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as prophets of 8th century BC left their village and carried, thus saith the Lord, far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so I am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to them, making a call for aid." So, this is him saying that to ignore Birmingham is an injustice, because his whole message was pushing for what he believed in, and he basically said that ignoring it would be unjust. And we can see that for a lot of different issues. Ignoring it is just as bad as supporting it. So we're going to go off to the next slide now. Why laws must be broken in the name of justice. So I'm going to read parts of these quotes because they're very long, obviously. If you could pause and read it if you like, but I just want to go through some key points. "One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly and lovingly and with willingness to accept the penalty." This goes back to what I was talking about as to why he protested in the first place, what you saw in the background video, is that he was willing to accept the punishment for the law because he felt it was unjust and he wanted to show it was unjust. So he broke it with the knowledge that he was going to be arrested for it. He wanted it to be a statement in a way. And I'm going to read this next part. "And who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community overall over its injustice." So he willingly accepted the penalty of imprisonment. And we see that obviously because he wrote this letter from Birmingham jail because of something that happened just like this. So we're going to go on to this next quote. And this one really paints a picture for you. "We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal. Everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal." And I feel like what he was trying to present when he said this is that even though something is considered legal or illegal doesn't mean it's necessarily just. And that applies to many things even today. Because something is legal or illegal doesn't mean that, it's just. And in that way, I feel like if an individual sees something as unjust, they have the responsibility to call it out and to do what Dr. King did and not simply ignore what's going on and confront it. And that's how many social issues actually get addressed. That's when a group of people come together and accept that this is unjust and they want to do something to change it. So, and now I'll read this last quote. "Law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the full flow of social progression." So to not call out these injustices is to stop society from growing. 100 years ago, what we consider just today was not considered just. And this, I could connect back to some of our previous readings about how laws evolve and how we discuss the fluidity of documents and how we can interpret them over time. because obviously we're not going to have the same years in the same values 100 years from now, or we might be the same, they might be different, we don't know. That's why interpretation and calling out these injustices is important for progression. So we're gonna be moving on to the next slide. The wait for justice. So this is powerful in itself, and it's pretty self-explanatory. Again, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I just want to focus on this key first part. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. And this is powerful. 340 years in a nation that claims to be free. You could feel the emotion behind this. You could feel the waiting, the patience, and the injustices. Next, we're going to go to what makes something unjust. To put it into terms of St. Thomas Augustine, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law, and any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. And he goes on saying that segregation laws are considered unjust by this reasoning, and therefore unjust laws should be replaced or fixed or changed, because it's not fair to a human's natural rights. So we're going to move on to the next slide. Why it was important. So this is obviously very important. His speech pushed people to protest the unjust laws any way they could, because following the rules was not leading towards a path of negotiation. I spoke about this a lot previously. Negotiation, it's very key, a general topic during this letter. And following the rules wasn't bringing them anywhere. So in order to make a greater statement, laws had to be broken. And they, again, accepted the consequences in order to show just how unjust these laws actually are. So we're going to go to the next one. This letter was written to light the flame of justice in the hearts of Americans to fight for a greater cause. That in itself is important, because he wanted to incite this feeling of empowerment, this feeling of bringing the law into their hands in the American people, in order to push them to do something that's going to bring greater light to the situation. Because as one person or another person gets affected, it's going to shine a greater flame. And that's what I feel like he was trying to do with this letter. So we're going to go to the next slide. Oh, okay. So this is Socrates. He mentions, obviously we read about Socrates and some of his work, some of his stories. So this is a quote from the actual letter. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to unfeathered realm of creative analysis and an objective appraisal, so much we see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. So he mentions how Socrates felt it necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths. So this is what he's basically doing again. He's creating tension in order to, show people the light, show people what's truly just in this world. And I feel like that message is powerful in itself. And he uses Socrates as a way to basically showcase this. So understanding that, we're going to move on to the next slide. When you see. This was a very important part in the reading, and he uses when you see, the beginning phrase when you see, to again push forward more feeling, more emphasis on what Black people in this time suffered and why it is unjust, and how it is easily noticeable and obvious to see what they were going through in this time and the terrible difficulties they struggled through and still struggle through to this day. So we're going to read this first. We're going to read a couple of these because obviously it's a lot. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you see the hate-filled police curse and kill your black brothers and sisters. And before I move on to the next one, this still happens today. This whole year, this past year's over and over again, we see black people getting killed by police. And this is something that since Martin Luther King's time, since before, hasn't changed. And in all honesty, that's sad. We as a community, this year we have begun more progressions toward these changes, and we have begun to recognize what's actually happening. And there's still people who are fighting on the opposite side, who are ignoring these facts, who are saying it's just one bad police officer. But we could go back to the previous statement saying that ignoring an injustice is an injustice in itself. So knowing that, we're going to go on to the next one. When you see the vast majorities of your 20 million brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an eviction society. When you suddenly find your tongue twisted and speech stammered as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park. 6 years old. I want to put emphasis on that. These are kids, these are children going through this injustice, and it's, in all honesty, unfair. It's unfair. So I'm going to move on to number 5 because this one's kind of long. You can pause and read it if you like. They're really emotional and full. So we're going to go on to the next page. Which are more when you see? When you're humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored. Things that constantly remind these people that they aren't treated fairly. They aren't treated the same. They are, quote unquote, inferior to the white man or the white woman, I guess. This is just, these phrases, when you see, is him showing life through the eyes of a black person in this time period. And it's terribly sad. You can pause and read the rest of these, but I'll move on to the next slide. I just want to close this segment by saying that reading these really paints the picture for how life was for a black person in this time, and how painful it was for families. These are people with emotions, and these are actual struggles they had to deal with in their everyday lives. And the fact that we as a society took so long and are taking so long to fix these injustices is terribly sad. So addressing that, we're going to move on to the next slide. And this is our last slide, obviously. These are the interesting art and ties to the art that I found interesting. The left one seems to be blurred, but I'll go ahead and insert another image of that. So the first one is I Have a Dream Catcher. In this image is a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. holding a Native American dream catcher. And both of these images are in Birmingham, and they're artworks, obviously. And I just wanted to show how this message has conveyed throughout the years. This first one was in 2015, that it was painted or spray painted. And then the other one is in Alabama in 2008. And this one, you can see it's of a Ku Klux Klan member getting hanged. These artworks are meant to signify a time period, and the second one I feel like is more signifying the end of a time period. And the eye is not lost in this artwork, and you can see on the right side of it, it's painted black. You know, someone you know, against this obviously felt the need to cover it up in an attempt to protest it, but in actuality it just shows further how willing people are to cover up emotions and what people think is unjust. So concluding this presentation, I want to ask you guys a question for your digital archives, and it is, how did MLK portray the relationship between justice and law? And you guys can answer this, but I'm gonna go ahead and end this presentation. Thank you so much, and you guys have a wonderful day.